Now, today's webinar is very exciting, and I can't wait to introduce Nigel and get started with today. And I wanted to just have a moment to talk a little bit about Fuse, where I'm dialing in from today. So you might not be familiar with Fuse Universal, but Fuse is an integrated learning platform, and we work with customers including Vodafone, Scandic Hotels, Hilti and Carpetright. And our main priority is helping them to create measurable business results by delivering learning, skills development and performance coaching to their employees and partners through our consumer grade technology. Now today I am delighted to welcome Nigel Paine, who is a leading learning consultant and author of multiple books, including his most recent Workplace Learning, all about building a culture of continuous learning and employee development. And that's exactly what he'll be speaking about today. Nigel, so excited to hear about what you've got to discuss today. Please, can we hear more from you?
Imogen, thank you and welcome everybody. I really appreciate you all coming and giving me an excuse to talk about learning culture. It's something that I spent a year of my life researching and then another 6 months of my life writing about it. So I've got something to say. You might disagree with me, but at least I've got some strong views and some evidence to present to you. And first of all, if we can just have a look at the chat box, what I would like you to do is make sure that your chat window is up and running. You can see from this little illustration that you just click on that chat icon and a window should pop up as if by magic. And that will be a place that we're going to come back to many times during the webinar, so that I want to be able to answer your questions or comment on your observations as we go through. And I'm not going to give you 75,000 slides and a monologue for an hour, because you'll be bored to tears after about 15 minutes. What I am going to do is suggest some ideas and a model of a learning culture to you, and then ask for your feedback. So I will be spending some time silent, believe it or not, over the course of the webinar, so I can read what you have to say, and it gives you a chance to reflect or write something in the chat box. I find it almost impossible to speak, keep a control of my desktop and manage the slides and read the chat box and reply. I'm not that clever. Other people are much better at me than that, so I will pause and read what you have to say as we go on.
Yes, and
Imogen.
we'll be collecting questions as they come into the chat box. So do put your questions into the chat box as Nigel is going through his presentation, and we'll pick them up and suggest them at the right opportune moments. Thank
you. Now, this is me. This is the reason why you don't switch the camera on. Be very relieved about that. This is the book, Workplace Learning, How to Build a Culture of Continuous Employment. I'm a presenter of Learning Now Television. I do a weekly podcast called From Scratch. I write a lot, and I work with companies. I'm about to leave the UK for the US at the weekend, and I'm presenting at the Learning 19 conference in Orlando, the Maisie Learning Conference in Orlando. So I get around. I'm going from Orlando to Mexico before I get back to London. So there's a lot of people from a lot of countries who are interested in these ideas, and I really am very, very pleased to share them with you, whether you're from Indonesia or just down the road in London. Let's have a talk. Let's work out what we're going to do. But I really have only one goal coming out of this webinar, and that is I want you to feel that you've got enough from the webinar to begin the journey, or to enhance the journey if you're already there. I want action to happen as a result of this webinar, so that the focus will be on what you can do to overcome the challenges, what first steps or what steps you need to take if you move in this direction. And I think it's a very important direction. And I'll explain why I think it's an important direction as we go forward. So if you want to people the chat box with what you want to get out of the webinar, that will be very, very helpful. So just tell us, Colin Mansell, 40 years in online learning. My goodness, as if 40 years seems like there was no online learning. But of course, when you go back 40 years, it's only in the 80s. There was much going on in the 80s. And my book actually goes back to the 80s and 90s. and traces the history of the learning organization and learning culture from those great thinkers then and brings it all up to date. But anyway, let's talk about learning culture. And this is my strong metaphor that runs through the book. And that is, learning culture is like an organizational gyroscope. And what I mean by that is very simple. That when you fly in an aeroplane, there is a gyroscope, probably lots of gyroscopes. There's at least one gyroscope in the cockpit. And that gyroscope has one unbelievably important function. It tells the pilot where the horizon is. And it then tells the pilot where the nose of the plane is in relation to that horizon. So that means when it's pitch dark, thick fog, the pilot knows where the plane is in relation to the external environment. And that is pretty vital. And that invention was one of the critical inventions that led to modern aeroplanes and modern aviation. So I extend that as a metaphor. And what I think is that an organization, learning in an organization, is the gyroscope that allows the organization to keep on track. And what spins that gyroscope, because a gyroscope, if any of you had a gyroscope as a child, it's a lump of metal until you spin it. And when it's spun, it's got the most extraordinary energy and capability. It's a really interesting piece of physics when you look at the forces at work in a gyroscope. I think it's learning that creates those forces and allows the organization to see where it is and where it's going. So I would define a learning culture as follows. This is my definition. I don't really care what other people say. This is what emerged. I didn't invent it. It emerged from my work with large numbers of organizations and from reading about learning culture. So I think it's not a static thing. You don't have it or you don't. You don't switch it on a Monday, switch it off on a Tuesday afternoon. It's a dynamic process. And the key is that you take insight and knowledge from outside the organization and share it across the organization and turn that insight into action, so that learning then becomes embedded and influences every part of the workflow. So it is about enabling the workflow and allowing people to make those adjustments, sometimes small, sometimes big, in the light of a very volatile and choppy external environment. And for me, I can't see any other way of doing it. I can't see any substitute for curious, well-informed staff who not only help themselves learn, but share that learning and behave in a collegiate manner across the organization. That's absolutely critical. If you can think of other ways, please share them with me. I've never found them. But the point about it is, and this is where I think a lot of focus on learning culture goes wrong. They focus on the individual. If we increase the quantum of learning, up pops a learning culture. I think it's exactly the other way around. If we focus on building a learning culture, up pops the learning. And where you have an organization where you've got expert individuals who don't share, who focus on their own needs, you do not have a learning culture, and it's actually very destructive and very, very difficult. And you often run into... Yes, please.
Yes, sorry. We've had a couple of questions in which really relate to this quite well. And it's the
Go
idea
ahead.
that people want to understand a bit more about how to change that mindset. So how to get organizations to understand that training isn't learning, changing this culture from course taker to almost, self-actualized learners, to transform this culture.
I think that's a really very, very good point. And what I would say is that you have to start having a big conversation, not a small, narrow conversation. I wanted to call the book Look Up, and the publisher said that was the most ridiculous idea they'd ever heard of, and there are 150 books called Look Up, so that was thrown out. But the point is that if you start to look at the whole organization, to understand what's going inside the organization, going on in the organization, rather than focus on let's develop another program or let's get a bit of training going. You then have a different conversation that isn't about we need a training course. You have a conversation about how do we engage employees? How do we begin to problem solve better? How can we share best practice fast around the organization? How can we better understand what our customers need? How can we see the issues and challenges that our staff face in order to do their jobs? They're the kinds of conversations that you need to have. So it's a bigger, more holistic conversation. And then you get those 4 points on the right-hand side of the screen: collaboration, sharing, purpose, and autonomy. It's about collaborating and being willing to collaborate and share, but doing it with a sense of purpose, everyone facing in the right direction, and with autonomy as well, a degree of autonomy, so that you've got an area where you are trusted to move forward on your own. And I was working in Australia with a group, and one of them was from a bank, and he said, you know, I've realized that the purpose that we avow in this bank really only concerns about 30% of the staff. There are 70% who have no real contribution to that purpose. And he said, we've got to change that. We've absolutely got to change that. And it's that sort of insight. So you have a common purpose, and you focus on that collaboration and learning. And for the learning team, it's about facilitating, enabling, working with, not about controlling, delivering, providing. Because if you can get it right, the learning will take care of itself almost. People will find their own level. They will come to you and say, we need some help with this. And that won't be give us a course. It will be, can we have a better place to share? And if you take technology, I think the big difference between what I came up with in the book and what Senge came up with in the 90s is that technology is inescapable. Hardly mentions technology in Senge. It's just an odd sentence. I think it's absolutely fundamental. But in my model, you don't just bring in technology. If you say, for example, we're going to get Fuse in, Fuse will be a brilliant way of collaboration and sharing. It is. But you have to have the right climate in order for Fuse to flourish. Just bringing in technology does not solve your problems. Technology is an enabler, works with, moves things forward, but it doesn't do it all on its own. If you have people who are miserable and don't want to share and don't want to collaborate, sticking in the most wonderful technology in the world isn't going to help you much. And then you're going to complain a year later, well, no one's using it. They're not using it because there isn't a culture of using it. Work on the culture, get the conditions right, and bang, the whole thing moves forward. So, good, thank you. I'm really pleased you said that.
Yeah. So we see what else have we got?
I'm just trying to look through the chat. I'm going to stop. I'm going to ask you to do a poll. Maybe I'll come on to the poll now and ask you if you can just answer the question, where are you in your learning culture? So are you right, you're coming to this webinar because you really don't really know much about it at all. You're right at the beginning of the journey, trying to get your head around it. Are you moving somewhere down the path? You've made real progress, or are you done and dusted? I suspect that those who are done and dusted wouldn't be here. So let me know if you could answer one of those. Pick one of those and we'll see. Meanwhile, I'm going to go back through so much contribution already. I'm really delighted. Thank you. Profoundly thank you for making the points that you're doing. It's great. And it makes me feel like there's a real group of people out there. I'm not just talking to a blank screen or to a brick wall. So I appreciate this enormously. And mindset is very important. One of my case studies is in L'Oréal, and the whole of L'Oréal's change program is focused around 6 mindset changes. So they're rebuilding the company and enhancing the learning and the sharing and the speed to market through mindset change. And mindset change means you have to tell people what is expected of them and help them make that move. And we live in often hostile territory in organizations, where a sharing curiosity mindset is frowned on. Get back to do your work. I didn't tell you to do that. Don't ask questions. Don't waste my time. Don't talk to anyone else. Just do it. And there was a famous bank in the UK whose motto was JFDI. That was what it was known for. F, I won't go into the exact meaning of F, but I think most of you can guess what it is. So around the place, whenever any issue was there, the command from the manager would be, just effing do it. In other words, no questions, no curiosity, no why, just do it. Guess what? In the first ripples of the financial crisis, that bank disappeared, almost. And it was awful to see it. Part of that was a culture that didn't allow anything close to a learning culture. Yes. So we've got 15%.
Yeah, we've got the results now.
That's great. So done and dusted 0%, as I suspected. That's a really good number, 60% somewhere on the journey. That's great. So what I hope from today is that we can progress a little bit further down that journey. So any advice or developments that I can use, mention to my clients, practical suggestions for what people need to be doing. Yes, let me just come on to that in 1 second. What I want to get, how do I get senior managers on board? And I think that you get senior managers on board by not even talking about a learning culture necessarily. Talk about making this business fly. Talk about dealing with some of the issues and conflicts that those managers know all about. Talk about the blockages that need to be unblocked in order to make progress. So there are organizations that, to me, embody a learning culture, but they never use that phrase. So it depends whatever floats your boat. If that is a good conversation, use it. If that turns off everyone, they roll their eyes when you talk about a learning culture, don't use it. Talk about increasing productivity. Talk about increasing engagement. Talk about bridging the skills gap. Talk about a workforce that is updating itself day to day and is pleased and happy to keep up with the changes in role, changes in skills. That's the crucial thing. So I'm going to close that poll. Thank you very much for that. That's a very interesting result. And on to the next slide. This is the model that I came up with in the book. And I'll just take you through it really quickly. And I tried to make it simple, because when I looked at Senge with his disciplines, his his 5 disciplines, his 15 learning disabilities, his 21 laws of organizations, you just begin to kind of go slightly faint at the thought of how on earth am I going to implement those? And even when I came up further into the present, and I looked at Josh Bersin's excellent report on learning culture, he has 40 criteria for a learning culture. So where do you start when there are 40? So I wanted to keep it really simple. So there is an inner and outer circle. And what seemed to be clear from the organizations that I worked with was that unless the outer circle was in place, there wasn't much chance of the inner circle working. So, for example, I discovered again and again that there is a massive difference between high trust and low trust organizations. And that may be your starting point. If you're in a low trust organization, what would it mean to increase the level of trust? Because if you don't trust people, why would you share? Why would you admit mistakes? What you do in a low trust organization is displace the blame onto someone else, always cover your backside, use BCC as a weapon in the organization, never take the blame, never admit. All you do is take the glory whenever the glory is anywhere close to you. And if that means stealing the glory from the person who did the work, so be it, because it's about you surviving against everyone else collapsing. So trust is fundamental, absolutely fundamental. And with trust goes engagement. People who get up in the morning looking forward to their job do way, way better and are much more willing to share, learn, build themselves and their career and their company than those who get up dreading the thought that they've got to walk into some place or log on to some place. And then empowerment. People need to feel that they have some agency in the organization. Far too many people at very many layers feel they have no agency, no empowerment. And often those people who rely on hard power, i.e. designated role to get what they want, create that toxic culture that I'm referring to. It's about soft power. It's about people who do things and help because people want to work with you, want to help you, want to be part of your team. So that, and around those three is leadership. Leadership has to embody those. If leadership, you can't have an engaged, empowered and trusting workforce and a toxic leadership. Leadership reflects above all the values and the attitude and the behaviors and the characteristics of the organization. Now, it's quite possible for a workforce that is ahead of the leadership to influence the leadership and help them move the organization forward. And it's also possible for an enlightened leadership to gradually impose some kind of mindset change on the workforce. But things like trust are very hard to win, unbelievably easy to lose. You can lose trust absolutely at the drop of a hat. All you have to do is say one thing and then do exactly the opposite. And many, many organizations, many leaders seem to think that it doesn't matter what they do, it's only what they say that matters. But we all know that the human brain doesn't work like that. I was at a conference the other week in Scotland, and one of the speakers said, put your hands on your head. Everyone put their hands on their head. Put your hands on your ears. Everyone put their hands on your ears. And then he said, put your hands on your nose. And then he touched his chin. And immediately everyone put their hands on their chin. They did what he did. They didn't do what he said. And that's just a classic illustration that we watch and we learn from watching. We don't necessarily do what people say. And when there's a contradiction, we always default to behavior. So behavior is really important, and consistent behavior through the organization. So once that outer circle is beginning to work, then you start with the inner circle, building opportunities for collaboration, having shared spaces. And this is where technology is really important. I can't say you can do it without technology, to be honest. You need places where people can question, they can share, they can put interesting information, they can ask questions and get those answered. And they can do that with a degree of autonomy. If you answer someone's question, it has to be cleared by 3 other people at a higher level in the organization. That is not autonomy. Autonomy is where we trust everybody. And the most interesting example of that is the Intellipedia that the CIA launched. They have like a Wikipedia of intelligence. And after massive fights, over many years, they experimented, and what they discovered was that they could trust their field operatives to update the Intellipedia in seconds when anything happened. And it would be reliable, more reliable than if they'd refer everything back to headquarters in the US and then back out to the field. And also so much more rapid and so much more creating a sense of trust and autonomy in the organization. So to me, one answer when we're going to say, oh, we'd never get that in our organization. If the CIA can do it, I think anyone can do it. They are obviously super security conscious, but you've got to trust people. And if you build your organization, around the wickedness of a teeny handful of people, and therefore you default to the worst, you're never going to build a learning culture. A learning culture defaults to the best and tries to get people to scale up to the best and not scale down to the worst. So then the next question is, who owns the culture and how do you build it? These are some of the questions that you're asking. I'm just trying to read your comments. So Louise says, learning is what is absorbed and embedded as a result of training, reading, watching, conversations that take place. Yes, I'm not saying that training is a terrible thing, we should never do it. But what I am saying, Louise, is that if the sum total of what you consider to be learning is what is trained, then you're missing reading, watching, conversations, and all of those things have to be enabled. And it's very interesting, if you read the last Towards Maturity report, something like 68% of organizations focus their efforts on building learning programs, and yet 90% of the staff said that what was important were the conversations with their peers. That's where they learnt the most. So you need to have an organization that recognizes that, facilitates it, and doesn't punish people for daring to be audacious enough to ask a question or have a conversation. And around that is the whole issue of being able to admit what you don't know, admit where something went wrong. That is hard in an organization with low trust. So Vivi says, I was just going to say,
yes.
Just let me answer this question from Vivi. She said, should we ditch the word learning and start the focus on performance support? I think performance support is enormously important, help in the workflow, but I also think sometimes you need to think quite deeply, and that isn't performance support. That is taking the performance to another level. I think you should have both. Whatever works in your organization. If you have an organization where talking about performance support, people say, yes, got it, Vivi, totally right. You talk about learning, they go, oh, well, that's a bit vague and fluffy. Talk about performance support. But remember, it's a bigger picture than that. Go on, off you go. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you. What were you going to say, Louise?
Yes. So there was a comment that I thought was quite pertinent here, a question actually from Margaret, and it says L&D don't always feel empowered to shape culture, so how can they influence?
That's another excellent point. Again, one of the starting points that I suggest to organizations is to L&D people, if you're in that position in L&D where, hey, there's a whole OD group and there's a whole group here and there's an HR people, stick to what you're supposed to do. Get another course out on the LMS. Go talk to staff. They'll tell you what stops them doing their best work, what the things that drive them absolutely insane about the organization are, the kind of blockages, the things that don't help them move forward. And if you do that, you can come back, and when you present the kinds of challenges, anyone without only half a brain will see that this is way more than just, it's a training problem. They need more training. It's much more complicated. And if you're going to move the organization forward, then the L&D people have to be involved in that bigger picture. So maybe not the whole picture, but they certainly need to be part of the team that helps build a different kind of organization. So it's really everyone facing in the same direction, and each group taking on their level of expertise and doing what they can do best. So you're part of the conversation, you're on the agenda, and you've got some big targets about the way we want the organization to change. So that, I don't want to keep going on about L'Oréal, but in L'Oréal, you've got the CEO saying, we need some fundamental changes in this organization. Therefore, everybody has to be involved in delivering that. So the L&D people were putting on the big programs and creating the climate and the conversations around the mindset changes. The OD people were making structural changes in the organization. The leadership were pointing towards successes and quick wins as they moved down on the journey. So they were all on the same journey. Each group had their specialist role to play, but it was only the total impact that will begin to shift the organization. You don't often shift an organization through one learning program. You shift an organization through making people think differently about the place they come to work for every day, and that's much more challenging.
Thank you.
I'm just looking again. That's all right. I'm just trying to see if is there anything else I've missed? Margaret. Yes, I think it is important for the CEO sees the need for change. But you can open the eyes of a CEO. One of my ideas about the model is that organizations are like kind of cells, biological cells, they have very strong walls that it's very difficult to permeate the cell. And a CEO can be more insulated and isolated than most, because people tell a CEO what they want her to learn or want her to know. They show her things they want her to see, and it all looks pretty good from her perspective. It's when you confront the CEO with the reality of customer experience, appalling trouble that staff have got in trying to do the simplest things, over levels of bureaucracy, bullying, toxic culture, best people leaving, all of that stuff. You suddenly find a CEO who doesn't really see any need, thinks things are going along nicely, gets that wake-up call. And when they get the wake-up call, they will start to, the next question is, okay, I get that. So what do we do? You've got to have an answer to that one as well. I'm not saying, yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Agreeing that everything is terrible is not a great way to move forward. And it is true also when a CEO joins, they have not got that impermeable cell wall. They just walk in from outside and go, wow, you do that? You treat people like this? You create this? I've been in organizations where they've had attrition rates of, middle managers running at, 50% a year, and just, well, that's the way it is, isn't it? And you say, it is not. That's not true at all. You can reduce that to maybe 10 or 14% quite easily. Really? And you suddenly see little eyes lighting up, because that's going to save them millions and millions of pounds a year, just without having to do unnecessary recruitment. So it is about helping people see with fresh eyes and building an alliance of those people who get it, and not worrying too much about the people who don't get it, because they will eventually get it. And it's just, if you're moving forward in this direction, if you want change, to say to the CEO, we want to change the whole organization overnight, you're unlikely to get that. If you say, look, can we work with this department? And that's a small group. They're ready for it. Can we experiment with this small group? And if it fails, we've lost very little. If it's success, we've got a model for the rest of the organization. You're much more likely to win that. And if all else fails, learning team, you model the behavior, you model what a learning culture might look like in the learning team itself. I remember working with Southwest Airlines, and the learning team there, they met every 6 months, and they divided up new ideas, new technologies, new things that they should be aware of. And they said, you research that, you research that, you research that, you research that. And then they came back again months later and said, right, let's share the learning. And some ideas went nowhere, didn't work, tried it for a week or two, no good. Others became the essence of how they were going to evolve their learning organization. So they modeled the behavior they wanted in the whole organization. And you can do that too. Any points, anything, Louise, that I should be have my attention drawn to?
Well, I think we've got some questions that have come through, but I'll save them for a little bit, because it'd be great to see what examples you've got to show us. Okay,
just to, there are lots and lots of companies, and I'm not going to go through each one of those laboriously, but the point this slide should make is that big and small, tech and non-tech, public and private, small not-for-profit and large for-profit, there's evidence that it's beginning to work in many different organizations. And if you just look at Microsoft, in the book there's a case study of Microsoft, and I'm almost overwhelmed with admiration for Satya Nadella and what he's done to Microsoft. And he said at the very beginning when he took over, we're going to be a company of learn-it-alls, not a company of know-it-alls. And if you'd worked with Microsoft, as I did in the old days of Steve Ballmer, it was full of people who never listened. They simply told you, this is our strategy, this is what you need to do to help us with our strategy. If you're not interested, clear off, we don't want you. And they were renowned for a level of arrogance and a level of unknowing about the world. What Microsoft did was right, anything else was rubbish. And also for these incredible wars they had between the various divisions of Microsoft. You know, they all seem to be fighting each other for supremacy. And what Nadella came in and said, hey, let's focus on the customer. Customer doesn't see 20 different Microsofts, it sees one. And he's focused on leveraging what they have. And what he's done, for example, with Office 365, the amount of apps that link those various key apps like PowerPoint and Word together, the stuff that does the analysis around Outlook is quite extraordinary. And the Microsoft Teams app that sits in the middle of all of that is a brilliant way for building collaboration. So he's saying, let's focus on making the way people work better, not on selling Word 25.3 to a group of people and give them features that they don't need. Let's focus on making all of this integrate. And what he's done with Office, he's done with the whole organization. So you end up with everyone being part of the Microsoft team. And whether they're in hardware or software, big enterprise software, small desktop software, it's now all integrated. And the result is spectacular. What he's done to the market cap of Microsoft is quite extraordinary. It's grown faster than Apple or Google or anyone else over the 4 years that he's been there. And if you'd have, stuck $100 into Microsoft shares on the day he arrived, that would be worth close to 1,000 now. It's just amazing the way that he has revved up the company and made everyone feel really proud of what Microsoft does, big and small. That he flew to Africa to go to an internet cafe because the staff in this internet cafe, paid a pittance, a very small internet cafe in the back streets in some city in Nigeria. What they've done is developed an app for those who were disabled to help them make use of the resources, the Microsoft app, Microsoft software. And he flew to that shop to thank them and to recognize what they'd achieved. And that place isn't going to make Microsoft any additional profit. It's not going to boost anything, but it's just a recognition that they're the people who can really enhance the product, focus on the needs of specialist needs of customers. They're the people that we want. And I'll just talk about WD-40. Someone said to me the other day, why on earth did you pick WD-40? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. The fact that everybody knows what it is. You've got a can in your cupboard, I bet you. The chief executive, Gary Ridge, came in 10 years ago when WD-40 had a market cap of $220 million, which is okay. It was seen as an incredibly boring, safe investment. I trickled along, grew by 1 or 2%. Everyone bought their can every 3 years or whatever it was, in just a few countries, manufacturing in one place. 10 years on, the market cap is now $1.6 billion. They're in manufacturing in 40 countries, on sale in 120 countries, and continuing to grow strongly. And he's done that through empowering his workforce, through learning. And he one of the phrases in WD-40 is not how you doing or how brilliant are you, but what did you learn today? And what did you learn today means share the mistakes as well as the successes. And often we learn more from mistakes than successes. And he has a kind of server, I think he calls it Blue Vault, where everything is. The formula, from the formula of the WD-40 through to marketing campaigns, analyses of different markets that they're in, successes and failures. It's a kind of repository. And he says we just make that richer every single day the company exists, because everyone wants to contribute and share the knowledge. Everything is transparent in the company. Everyone knows what everyone is paid. It's not a great payer way above the market rate. They pay at market rate, but they pay fairly. They distribute the surplus fairly amongst staff. And the other thing about WD-40 is that if you're a manager, you're not called a manager, you're called a coach. And your job as a coach is to make sure that all the staff who report to you live the values, do their job to the best of their ability. And that is your job. That is your job, to enable the people who work for you. So it's a very interesting culture focused on creating an environment where staff can flourish. And the results are amazing. I think. Absolutely amazing. And HT2 Labs, which is a small UK software company, now owned by Learning Pool. It was bought while just after the book came out. And Ben Betts, who runs the company, even though it's a small software company, and even though there's a huge market for good programmers, as you all know, highly competitive market, HT2 had not lost a single coder for 5 years. That is amazing. Everyone else lost between 40 and 80%. And they stayed because they learned, because they love the place. And they have staff in Boston, they have staff in Oxford, they have staff in other parts of the country. And once a week at least, either Ben or his father, who actually works in the company, senior role in the company, they phone up every single member of staff not actually in their main office to make sure everything's okay, find out what they're doing. And on a Friday, they have a virtual party. So they stop work at 4 o'clock. Wherever anyone is in the world, they stop too at the equivalent of 4 o'clock. Pretty good if you're in the US, because it's only 11 a.m. in Boston. And you just have a beer or whatever you want, a fruit juice, and you talk about the week. How's it gone? What are the issues? And they just stay in touch with each other in an amazing way. How the company does is on a whiteboard in the main office for everyone to see. No, they don't hide stuff. They don't pretend they're doing well when they're not, or pretend they're not doing well when they are. So it's a transparent culture that focuses on helping people be their best and allowing people to completely reinvent their job if they see the need, if they understand the benefit that could accrue to the company. So all of these things are really important, and they make a big difference to every single one of those organizations. And learning, they don't necessarily call themselves learning cultures, but they do call themselves organizations that are happy to share mistakes, happy to build and learn and grow and get better day by day, week by week. And that's another important part of a learning culture. As I said at the very, very beginning, a learning culture is not static, it's dynamic. So the way Microsoft was a year ago, it's better this year, it'll be better next year. It's a big company, it's got a way to go on its journey. But it's still on that journey of being a company of learn-it-alls, not a company of know-it-alls. And I think that's a fantastic expression. And how many of you can put your hand on your heart and say, oh yeah, my company is full of learn-it-alls, not know-it-alls? Sadly, most of us don't work in those kinds of organizations. So again, I'm going to pause there. And any comments, Louise, that I should be looking at?
No, nothing's come in yet, but I know we've got some more discussion coming up shortly.
Right, okay. We have indeed. Let me just move on. So this is moving towards the challenges that you face. So can you use the chat box? If you agree with me, and maybe some of you will be resisting very hard, but if you agree with me, what's stopping you? And that's what I mean by the greatest challenge. What stops this happening in your organization? Let's have a look at the challenges. And then I'll share some of the common challenges that people have told me, and maybe some suggestions. I don't have all the answers, but I have at least some of the answers. And often, if you start small, you attack, if not the whole challenge, part of the challenge. It just gets you into the conversation, and then you begin to have an interesting movement forward. And that's what it's about. It's about moving the organization forward. That's a very good question. Let me just pick that one, Glenn. Does a learn-it-all learn the answers, information, or is it more about helping them to learn how and where to find the answers? It's much more the latter. A learn-it-all rather than know-it-all is someone who is basically humble and curious and asks questions. So you learn what it's like. For example, in Microsoft, they spend time actually listening to customers, explaining the challenges they have, trying to integrate, trying to use some aspects of the software. Previously, they had customers who they wanted to listen to tell them how great Microsoft was and what a wonderful products that they created. And they didn't care much beyond that. So it's about humble questioning and about getting at the root cause. You know, Jeff Bezos has his 5 or 6 levels of why. So why does that happen? And then, well, why does that happen? And why did that cause that to happen? And Jeff Bezos' view is that you need to get down to the root cause at probably layer 5 before you understand the truth. Many organizations rest on the surface. They don't have complex conversations about difficult challenges. That's where, you know, Agaris, the Harvard professor who worked with Senge in the 80s and 90s, and he only died recently. He's a remarkable one. He talked about wicked problems, about double loop learning. It's not good enough just to think you have the answer. You have to question whether that is the real answer or whether there's a different problem hiding, masquerading amongst the superficial answer that you have to really investigate. And you need to be questioning and listening and sharing and consulting to be able to deal with that. And that's, I think, why action learning, which was invented in the 70s by Reg Revans and died a death in the 90s and 2000s, is coming right back. Because action learning is about a group of colleagues asking questions to really profoundly understand the issue that they're dealing with. And more people are having to deal with what Agaris will call wicked problems, i.e. problems that can't be solved superficially and need time and effort and more than one brain, and certainly not an expert. Experts know the answer to certain things. Experts in wicked problems can often get in the way because they come up with a pat answer, whereas you need to drill down. And an organization where that kind of profound learning takes place solves its problems far, far quicker than an organization that appears to have all the answers. And it has all the answers until it collapses. So your Margaret, action learning is a great technique. It is. And it's also part and parcel of that learning culture, colleagues coming together and solving problems. And I've just written a report on innovation in leadership development across 14 big companies in Europe. And interestingly, peer learning is one of the big trends in leadership development now, because waiting for someone to do it to you, when you've got it's too complicated, you need to do it to yourself and work it out together, is by far the most useful way forward. Because things change so quickly, by the time you brought the person in to tell you what to think and what to do, it's already changed. So focusing on peer group learning, usually through action learning, that's the most common form of peer group learning that I've discovered, certainly in leadership development.
We've had a couple of questions come in actually about budget. So
yes.
Do you have any comments about budget being a big challenge within this?
Yes, I have. And I think it's true that if there is no money to do anything, it's very hard to do anything. But often the problem with budget is overestimated. That you can do stuff just by getting people to work. You can do stuff by negotiating someone else's money and someone else's budget. If they think that they're going to get a result, they'll pay for it. And in some ways, not coming laden with goods is a good way of encouraging people to really look at where the benefits lie and putting their money where their mouth is. Whitney, let me see what Whitney said. Budget is the biggest issue, and many defer to, we have invested in online learning, but it's not enough. In-class is great. I like the idea of peer learning, but doesn't the person need to be certified and getting money to get them certified itself? No, not necessarily. It's not true. In the US, there is a qualification for an action learning facilitator. No such thing exists in the UK, and there are tens of thousands of action learning sets which go on very successfully around the UK, which have been kicked off, or around the world, being kicked off by someone who's not certified but knows what they're doing. And often that's the learning person, and the learning person then can share their expertise with someone else and they can take over. So facilitation is important, but it doesn't have to be certified facilitation. That can be helpful, but it's not essential. So I think where you're looking for money to get someone qualified to do something that no one's clear of the benefit is unlikely to succeed. Because the first thing they do is say, not sure about that, and then you're paralyzed. I think you've got to make progress without needing to get some big external validation. Maybe that comes later. You know, it's like saying, if I had an MBA, I'd be much better at this. So would you pay for an MBA? The answer is probably in many instances, no, I wouldn't pay for an MBA. But there's stuff you can do that allows you to get some of those skills and implement some of those skills without actually having to go through an MBA. That may be somewhere down the track. The CMA, coaching and mentoring qualification, there is, Margaret, there is a CMI unit. That's true. There is stuff around. And you have a really good, that will give you a really good background. But as I say, if no one's prepared to give you the time or the money, come back to that later and don't let that stop you doing stuff. But that's, thank you, that's a very interesting, useful unit. And it's not incredibly expensive or incredibly complicated or will take you an incredible long time. But it gets you the basics. So to clarify, facilitating action learning unit, what does that mean, Margaret? Can you clarify? Can you clarify your clarification?
We have had a really interesting question actually coming from Vera, just about any ideas on language. So, you know, while working in 20 plus countries, working in an organization which is global, so how do you decide what needs to be distributed on a global versus what is not necessarily needed?
Yes, I think that's true. And there's always that battle between central and distributed and central culture and local culture. To me, if you're having these conversations, what you're aiming for is a set of behaviors, a set of actions, but you're not determining the exact pathway. For example, in some organizations, getting peer-to-peer communities to open up is more challenging than others. So if you impose that, you're not going to get a good result. If you work with those cultures where that is familiar and comfortable, and then show those cultures where it isn't, the kinds of benefits, then they will work it out themselves and they'll get there. So I think you allow as much flexibility in terms of the local environment and the local culture, but you don't compromise on behavior. For example, you don't say, well, in this particular culture, bullying is just, it's regularly what people do, so we just turn a blind eye to that. No, you don't. If you're serious about building a learning culture, if you have bullying and shouting, that is not acceptable. It may be more difficult to deal with in certain places, but that's still no excuse for putting up with things. So you just work out what you need. You work out what are the outcomes you want to achieve, and then you expect everyone to begin to deliver those in the way that is most appropriate. Yes. Yes,
we have about 5 minutes left, so I just wanted to give enough time to have any final questions and also to wrap up.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's just look at some of the. These are a few challenges that people tell me. The problem of building trust, getting leadership support, influencing the organization. How do you create purpose? And of course, how do you develop engagement? And what about places to share? So they're just, I'm not going to read those out because that would be enormously tedious. But you can see that there are always places to start. And you've got to work out your own particular direction and work out where the biggest challenges are, particularly the biggest challenges that are relatively easy to overcome. And then you can begin to transform the organization. But if you look at these, for example, in terms of leadership support, ask for executive sponsorship of any program. American spelling, forgive me. If you ask for sponsorship, you're not demanding support. You're getting the person on the executive who is sympathetic at least and say, would you sponsor this? Once you've got someone sponsoring it, guess what? They're committed. And if it's a success, you take them in and you show them the elements of the program. They then talk to the other executives. And that little simple thing that costs nothing, that takes no time or effort, and is very non-onerous for the individual concerned, can be the key that opens the door to the whole leadership team. So it's very important that you find out what you need to do to understand what needs to be done in the organization to take it forward. And there is no formula. You need to work out the small things that unlock the bigger steps to progress. That's absolutely critical. American spelling is the best, says Michael. When I'm in the US, once I was in the US and I wrote program with MME, and someone said, hey, you're in the US, why don't you spell like us? So I made a point of changing my spelling depending on where I am, which is really good until I start writing stuff and I get hopelessly muddled up with spelling behavior and program and so on. But I think you're right. If you are in the US, it's definitely the best way to spell. If you're in the UK, it's possibly not the best way to spell. Let's have pluralism and let's celebrate everyone else's differences. And the purpose around helping everyone live the values, just explore. You can do so much work on helping people understand why the organization has values and what it means to live the values. And many organizations still just kind of put them up on the wall. And that's the last you ever hear, see, or do about the values. Whereas at the heart of the values can be massive guide to behavior. And in WD-40, they have the values in a hierarchy. So when there's an issue, you go to value 1. If that's okay, you go to value 2. And that is enormously helpful. They claim that it sorts out virtually any conflict. Go back to the values. So there are ways forward which you could develop learning around the values. For example, if you think that if your perception is that's a bad one, they are badly used. Right. So we're coming up to the end.
Yeah. So
and I want to pick up any last points.
Well, we don't have much time left for questions, but what we can do is follow up with any questions by email afterwards, because we've actually run out of time for today.
Yeah, so please, the goal is take some action. What are you going to do? When we finish this webinar, which we will in less than 30 seconds, please don't just dial off, go back to your calls. Just sit and think a little bit and say, what did I really get out of this? What will I do as a result of this? And then write down the one action you're going to take. I think that will make things so much more tangible and helpful for you coming away. But thank you for so many comments, almost impossible to keep pace with the number of comments. And if I missed something, I really apologize. I did my best, but I couldn't scroll through everything as fast as it was appearing on the screen. So I think we're done.
It's great.
And thanks for sticking with it.
Yeah, there's so many comments coming in saying thank you. So I think it was very valuable for everyone. And certainly thank you from us for today. It's been really illuminating for us as well to listen to you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. That's great, Louise and Imogen. Thank you all at Fuse Universal as well for having the idea of the webinar, facilitating it so well, and also getting so many people online. That's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.